The Galactic Armada had known nothing but dominance for millennia. Their fleets stretched across the cosmos, a living testament to their power. Every world they conquered fell before their might. Every civilization they encountered bowed before them. They were the galaxy apex. The very concept of defeat was foreign to them. They crushed their enemies with effortless precision. Their technology, beyond the comprehension of any lesser species. Their ships were enormous, towering machines of destruction that could vaporize entire fleets with a single shot. They had no equal, and they knew it as they sailed through the stars. They did so with the arrogance of kings who believed their rule would never end. They controlled the vastness of space without question or challenge. The Armada had witnessed countless species rise and fall. Civilizations that had once believed they were destined for greatness had been reduced to nothing. Their worlds turned to ash. Their people enslaved or exterminated. Those who survived were forced into submission. The few who resisted were destroyed without mercy. The Armada had become the galaxy's eternal overlords. Their names struck fear into every corner of space. Every species knew that to stand against the Armada was to invite annihilation. But then there was the signal. It was weak at first, a faint blip on the radar, something so insignificant that it barely registered on the Armada sensors. It was so far out on the fringe of the galaxy that it could have been anything: a malfunction, a stray transmission, a dying star sending out its last gasp of energy. But something about it caught the attention of the fleet's highest command. They ordered their best scouts to investigate the source of the signal to ensure that it posed no threat. As the scouts moved toward the coordinates, they began to notice something strange. The signal grew stronger. It wasn't just some random anomaly, it was intentional. And it was coming from a region of space that the Armada had never explored before, a place so far beyond their usual reach that it had never crossed their minds to investigate. The scouts pressed on, unsure of what they were heading toward, but confident that whatever it was, they would crush it with ease. The scouts returned with news that sent ripples of unease through the command fleet. They had found something. They had found a ship, a single human warship that had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Its energy readings were unlike anything they had ever encountered. It was small, almost insignificant in comparison to their own vast fleets, yet there was something about it that made the Armada commanders uneasy. It was like a flicker in the darkness, a tiny light in the vast expanse of space that refused to go out. They didn't understand why the human ship was there, but they knew that something had to be done to eliminate the threat. The human vessel was unlike anything the Armada had ever seen. It was sleek and compact, designed for speed and agility rather than raw firepower. Its hull was made of materials they couldn't identify. Its energy signatures were erratic yet oddly stable. There was nothing about the ship that should have made it a match for the power of the Armada, yet there it was, defying the odds, simply existing in a place where it had no right to be. The fleet commanders began to murmur among themselves, doubts creeping into their minds. But they quickly silenced them. They were the Armada. Nothing could stand against them. They ordered a full-scale assault. No more hesitation, no more waiting. They sent wave after wave of their fastest fighters toward the human ship, expecting to destroy it. In a matter of moments, the fighters engaged, their weapons powered up, and the Armada commanders sat back confident that the battle would be over before it had even begun. But then something strange happened. The human ship didn't move. It didn't attempt to flee or fight back. It remained still, floating in space, as if daring the Armada to strike it. The fleet commanders exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what they were seeing. The fighters closed in and launched their first wave of attacks. The blasts of energy tore through the vast emptines of space, hitting the human ship with full force. Yet, when the dust settled, the ship was still there, untouched. The commanders couldn't believe it. How could something so small withstand their firepower? They ordered a second wave of attacks, but again the ship didn't move. It simply absorbed the barrage as if it were nothing. The Armada commanders stared in disbelief. They had never encountered anything like this before. The human warship had become an enigma, one that refused to break or retreat, one that seemed to mock the Armada power. It stood there like a challenge to their entire existence, as if it knew something the Armada did not. It was a riddle that needed to be solved. But in that moment, the Armada once unwavering confidence began to waver. There was no understanding of what they were facing, and for the first time in centuries, the Armada felt doubt creeping into their hearts. The fleet commanders were growing frustrated. Their arrogance had made them believe that this would be over quickly, that they would wipe out the human ship with ease. But that didn't happen. The more they attacked, the more they realized they were up against something they didn't understand. The human ship was still there unscathed, its shields held strong against every assault they threw at it. The Armada's finest weapons had failed to penetrate its defenses, and they couldn't figure out why. They had never encountered anything like this before. They had to know more. They couldn't let this ship live any longer. It had to be destroyed, no matter the cost. The human vessel continued to float in the emptiness of space, its presence in the void like a stubborn reminder of the one thing the Armada never considered: the possibility that something could stand against them. This ship wasn't retreating, it wasn't surrendering, it wasn't even trying to flee. It simply existed, as if daring them to bring all their power against it, as if it were waiting for them to make the first move. The Armada's commanders quickly realized that their previous tactics weren't working. They couldn't keep throwing waves of fighters at the human ship forever. They needed something stronger, something capable of breaking through its defenses. They called for their most powerful warships to engage it. The massive behemoths of the fleet moved into position, each one capable of obliterating an entire planet. But even as they aligned their firepower to bear on the human vessel, the strange feeling of unease crept over them once more. The human ship remained unmoving in the face of the Armada's greatest strength. Its hull gleamed like a beacon of defiance against the vastness of space. It was almost as if the ship itself was mocking them. Every weapon they launched was absorbed by its shields. Without so much as a ripple, the Armada's leaders couldn't understand how this was happening. No species in the galaxy could withstand their firepower, not even the most advanced civilizations they had encountered. Yet here was this human ship laughing in the face of their might. The commanders ordered a concentrated barrage of fire from their warships. Every weapon fired at once in a blinding flash of energy. The Armada unleashed everything they had, all their power, all their strength, aimed at the lone human ship. But still the ship held firm. The shields flared bright, and then settled back into place, as if the attacks had never even happened. The Armada's forces began to realize that they were no longer in control. The human ship wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. It was beginning to turn the tide against them. It was as if the human warship had become something more than just a ship. It had become a symbol of resistance, something the Armada hadn't seen in centuries, a challenge to their very existence. They tried to regroup, but their confidence had shattered. The human ship was too unpredictable, too powerful, too dangerous. They had no idea how to approach it anymore. They had spent so long crushing everything in their path that they had forgotten what it meant to be truly threatened by an enemy they didn't understand. The human vessel suddenly powered up its engines and moved in a way that defied all logic. It wasn't simply dodging, it was anticipating their movements. It was as if the ship knew exactly what the Armada would do before they did it. The precision with which it evaded their attacks left the Armada's fleet commanders dumbfounded. They had no time to react to such speed. They couldn't even catch a glimpse of where the ship would strike next. And then it happened. The human ship launched its counterattack without warning. Its weapons blazed to life and fired beams of energy that tore through the Armada's warships like paper. The first blast hit the nearest warship and tore a massive hole through its hull. Within seconds, the warship exploded into a fiery ball of destruction. The rest of the fleet watched in horror as the human ship began to pick off their vessels one by one. The Armada had been defeated by a single ship, a ship that shouldn't have been able to stand against them. But now it was happening, and they were helpless to stop it. The chaos spread quickly through the Armada as they watched their most formidable warships fall to the relentless assault of the human ship. The first explosion was only the beginning. The next warship was struck down seconds later, its engines igniting in a brilliant flash of light. The Armada's commanders scrambled to react, but they were caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the human ship's counterattack. Every move they made seemed to be anticipated. Every time they repositioned or adjusted their weapons, the human ship was already one step ahead. Their massive fleet was now disintegrating piece by piece. The commanders barked out orders, but their voices faltered as they watched their mightiest vessels succumb to the human ship's firepower. It was no longer a battle, it was an execution. As the Armada's warships began to retreat in disarray, the human ship followed closely, moving with a speed that should have been impossible for its size. It wasn't just the ship, it was the crew. The humans aboard this vessel were not just warriors, it was something else, something that made the ship more than a machine. They were fighting with a purpose, an unrelenting desire to win, a desire that burned with an intensity the Armada had never faced before. It was clear now that they weren't fighting just for survival, they were fighting for something much deeper, something the Armada could never understand. The human ship fired again and again, its energy blasts cutting through the Armada's lines like a blade through silk. It was surgical, the destruction was precise, every shot taken with ruthless efficiency. The fleet commanders realized that their initial arrogance had blinded them to the reality of this warship. This wasn't just a ship from a species they considered primitive. It was a weapon forged in the fires of necessity, a symbol of resilience that they could not comprehend. The Armada's fighters scrambled to form new attack patterns, but it didn't matter, they were no longer in control. The human ship was everywhere. At once it danced through the battlefield, weaving between their attacks, as if it were an extension of the void itself, each movement calculated and perfect. It was as though it had been built with the express purpose of destroying the Armada, and nothing could stop it. The warships tried to regroup, but the damage was too extensive. Their shields were failing, their engines were slowing, and their weapons were losing their effectiveness against the human ship's impenetrable defenses. The commanders issued orders to retreat, but it was too late. The human ship had already closed in on them, and they were trapped with no way to escape. The Armada's once great warships were now drifting helplessly in space as the human ship systematically dismantled them one by one. The human crew was silent, their faces locked in a collective focus as they continued to strike down the Armada's fleet. Their captain stood at the helm, unshaken by the destruction unfolding around them. They had been here before, they had fought battles like this and come out victorious. The crew knew what was at stake, but they also knew what it meant to never give up. They had no intention of losing. They weren't going to stop until the Armada was driven from their galaxy for good. The battle had become something greater than a mere military clash. It had become a declaration that humanity would not be conquered. And yet, the Armada's commanders still couldn't comprehend it. They still didn't understand how a species they had so thoroughly underestimated could have produced a ship capable of this kind of destruction. Their own fear was now growing into a terrifying realization. They were no longer the rulers of the galaxy. They were the prey. They were the ones being hunted. And the hunter was relentless. The human ship fired again, its energy blasts shaking the void itself as another of the Armada's warships crumbled into nothingness. The Armada's leadership realized they were no longer facing a ship, they were facing a force that was determined to end their reign. And for the first time in centuries, the Armada felt the sting of true fear. As the last of their warships fell to the human ship, the Armada's commanders were no longer issuing orders. They were scrambling, trying to figure out what had gone so horribly wrong. Their once pristine fleets had been reduced to debris floating in space. Their greatest warships turned to shattered remnants of their former selves. They tried to regroup, but the human ship was everywhere. It was as if the ship had become a part of the fabric of space itself, appearing where they least expected it, firing at will and cutting through their forces with brutal efficiency. The Armada's fighters were in disarray. Some tried to retreat, but the human ship was too fast, too precise. It picked them off, one by one, leaving no escape. Panic began to spread across the Armada's command deck as the fleet's leaders realized that they were on the verge of losing everything: their pride, their power, their empire. It was all slipping away, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The human ship wasn't just a ship, it was a storm, a force of nature that could not be contained. No matter how many ships the Armada threw at it, no matter how many tactics they tried, nothing worked. They were helpless against this enemy they didn't understand. They had underestimated humanity for too long. The human warship continued to fire relentlessly. It never paused, it never hesitated, its cannons blasting a constant stream of energy that tore through the Armada's remaining ships. There was no pattern to its attack. It didn't follow any recognizable combat doctrine. It wasn't about tactics or strategy. It was about one thing: survival. The human ship fought like a creature desperate to stay alive. and in doing so it became a nightmare for the Armada's fleet commanders. The warship moved with an agility that seemed impossible, its hull twisting and turning with unnatural grace, avoiding fire with ease and retaliating with deadly accuracy. Each strike was calculated to cause maximum damage. It knew exactly where to hit, how to hit, and when to hit. The Armada's commanders were now gripped by a cold realization. They had been up against something far beyond their expectations. They had fought countless enemies in the past, but none had ever fought with such fury and determination. It wasn't just the human ship's capabilities that terrified them. It was the way it fought, as though it were an extension of its crew's will, as though the ship itself was alive and driven by a single purpose: to destroy them. The human ship's captain remained at the helm, unmoved by the destruction unfolding all around them. The crew didn't need to speak to each other. They moved with perfect synchronization, their focus unwavering. As they brought down the Armada's remaining ships, one by one, the captain knew that this was more than just a battle. It was a statement that humanity would not bow to the galaxy's greatest empire, no matter how overwhelming the odds, no matter how impossible the fight. The Armada's fleet was beginning to break apart. They had tried everything they could think of to stop the human ship, but nothing worked. The fear that had begun to creep into the hearts of their commanders had now taken root. It was no longer just about strategy or firepower. It was about survival. The human ship had proven that it was stronger than anything they could throw at it, and now they were running out of options. The last remaining ships of the Armada turned tail and tried to flee, but the human warship was relentless. It pursued them with an unyielding drive, closing the distance between them and picking off the last of the Armada's fleet with terrifying efficiency. There was no escape, no hope left for the once great empire. They had thought themselves invincible, but now they were nothing more than a defeated enemy, running for their lives from a single human ship that had brought them to their knees. The final blow came when the last of the Armada's warships was disabled. The human ship loomed over the wreckage, a silent victor in a battle that had once seemed impossible. A single ship had destroyed the most powerful fleet in the galaxy, and in doing so it had proven that the human spirit was more than just a force to be reckoned with. It was a force that could not be broken. As the final warship of the Armada drifted helplessly in space, its hull torn apart and its engines gone, the human ship loomed overhead, its weapons still charged and its engines running at full power. The crew of the human warship stood silent, their eyes fixed on the wreckage of the once mighty Armada's fleet. They had won, but the victory felt hollow. There were no cheers, no celebrations, just the quiet realization that they had done something that no one else had ever managed to do. They had broken the unbeatable. They had shattered the galaxy's greatest empire, and now they were left to face the silence of the void around them. The captain of the human ship stood at the helm, his hands steady on the controls, his eyes never leaving the damaged ships below him. The mission had been a success, but it was more than that. It was a statement to the galaxy, to the Armada, and to anyone who thought they could conquer humanity. It was a message that humanity would not bow to any force, no matter how powerful, no matter how impossible the fight seemed. They would rise up, they would fight, they would win. The fleet commanders of the Armada had been humiliated, their once pristine empire now reduced to nothing more than scattered wreckage in the cold emptiness of space. They had underestimated the humans. They had thought them weak, primitive, a species that could easily be crushed beneath the boot of the galaxy's rulers. But they had been wrong. The human ship had been more than just a war machine. It had been a symbol of the strength of the human spirit, a spirit that could not be broken, no matter the odds, no matter the power they faced. The human ship's crew now turned their attention to the wreckage they had left behind. They had no interest in capturing the remaining ships. They had no desire to enslave the survivors. They had done what they set out to do. They had destroyed the Armada and shown the galaxy that humanity would not be ruled by anyone, no matter who they were or what they controlled. The Armada's fleet was no more, and humanity had proven that it could stand against the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known. The captain issued orders to begin the return journey back to Earth. The mission was complete. But the war was not over. There were still other threats out there in the galaxy, other empires that would try to subjugate humanity, other species that would try to take what was theirs. But now the humans knew that they had the power to fight back, they had the power to win, and that knowledge would fuel them as they moved forward into a new age of uncertainty. As the human ship began its journey back home, the silence of space pressed in around them. The crew had done what many thought was impossible. They had faced the impossible odds and emerged victorious. But the journey was far from over. They would face new challenges, new battles, and new enemies. But they would face them as a united force, with the memory of this victory behind them to remind them that no matter how dark the galaxy seemed, humanity would always find a way to rise above it all. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson that day, but it was one they would never forget. Humanity was no longer just another species to be ignored or underestimated. They were a force in the galaxy, a force that could no longer be ignored. As the stars stretched out before them, the crew of the human warship couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had accomplished. They had defied all expectations. They had proven that even the mightiest empire could be toppled by a single ship, a single crew, a single human spirit. And though their journey was far from over, the victory was theirs, and the universe would never be the same again. As the human warship sailed through the vast expanse of space, its crew remained vigilant. Their victory over the Armada was not something they could afford to dwell on for long. The galaxy was a vast and dangerous place, and though they had toppled the greatest empire in the stars, there were many more threats waiting beyond the horizon. The captain of the warship stood at the helm, scanning the star systems ahead of them, knowing that they could not afford to rest on their laurels. Humanity had made a statement, but now they had to prepare for whatever came next. The human crew knew the war with the Armada was just the beginning. They had proven that they could fight and win against overwhelming odds, but that victory had come at a great cost. The Armada's fleet had been enormous and powerful, but there were other fleets out there, other factions that had watched the battle unfold, and now knew what humanity was capable of. The captain knew that they could not afford to let their guard down for a single moment. The galaxy was full of dangers, and they would have to face them head-on. Back on Earth, the news of the victory over the Armada spread like wildfire. The people of Earth could hardly believe it at first. They had been told for so long that humanity was insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe, that they were just another species struggling to survive on a small planet in the corner of the galaxy. But now they knew differently. Now they understood that humanity was not weak. They were not insignificant. They were powerful, and they had proven it in the most dramatic way possible. Humanity's victory over the Armada sent shockwaves through the galaxy. It was a wake-up call for the other empires who had thought that their dominance was unchallenged. It was a message that no one was safe, that even the most powerful empires could fall, and that humanity would no longer be content to cower in the shadows. They would fight for their place in the galaxy. They would fight to protect their home and their future. As the human warship made its way back to Earth, the crew reflected on what they had accomplished. They had faced the greatest military force in the galaxy and come out victorious. They had struck a blow against an empire that had ruled the stars for millennia. And they had done it not with superior technology or sheer numbers, but with something much more powerful: the strength of their resolve, the unity of their people, and the will to survive. The captain paced the deck of the warship, lost in thought. They knew the victory over the Armada was important, but it was only the beginning. They had to prepare for the next challenge, whatever that might be. They couldn't afford to be complacent. They had to keep pushing forward. They had to keep fighting. They couldn't let the enemy regroup and launch another assault on humanity's future. But for now, they would take a brief moment to savor the victory they had earned. So much had been accomplished, and yet there was still so much more to do. The crew had earned their rest, but it wouldn't last long. Soon they would be heading back into the unknown of the galaxy, where new enemies would emerge and new battles would be fought. But for this moment, they could breathe easier, knowing that humanity had proven its strength, knowing that no one in the galaxy would ever dare underestimate them again. As the human warship made its final approach to Earth, the stars faded into the distance, and the ship entered the atmosphere. The crew stood at attention, each one of them remembering the battles they had fought and the enemies they had defeated. They had stood together against an unstoppable force and emerged victorious. They were no longer just humans, they were warriors, and the galaxy would never forget what they had done. The human warship landed back on Earth, with the silence of victory hanging in the air. The crew disembarked one by one, their faces wary, but resolute. They had accomplished the impossible. They had faced the greatest military force in the galaxy, and they had won, but the celebration was brief. The captains stood among them, their mind already on the next steps. The victory over the Armada had sent shockwaves through the galaxy, but now the real work began. Humanity had proven its strength, but that didn't mean the galaxy would let them rest. There were always new threats, always new enemies, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike, and the captain knew that humanity's fight was far from over. The world was forever changed by the defeat of the Armada. Humanity had stood up and shown the galaxy that they were no longer willing to be pushed around, that they were a force to be reckoned with. The news spread across the globe as people everywhere celebrated the victory, their hearts filled with pride. But the captain and their crew knew that this was just the beginning. They had broken the most powerful fleet in the galaxy, but there were still many other threats to face. The human leadership began to regroup as they realized they would need to build on their victory. They could not allow the galaxy to forget the strength of humanity. They would need to strengthen their defenses, to train their soldiers, to develop their technologies. Even further, the warships of the Armada had been powerful, but now humanity knew they needed more. They needed to prepare for whatever might come next. The captain knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges. There would be enemies who would seek revenge for the fall of the Armada, and humanity had to be ready for them. In the weeks that followed, Earth began to see changes. The human military expanded as the government began to invest heavily in new weapons and technologies. They knew that they could not afford to be complacent, that enemies would not rest. They would adapt. They would learn from the battle with the Armada, and they would come back stronger. Humanity's leadership understood that the fight they had won was just the opening salvo in a larger conflict, and they needed to prepare for the wars to come. The captain returned to the warship to lead their crew once more. The ship that had carried them to victory was now a symbol of humanity's strength and resolve, but it was also a reminder of how far they had to go. They could not afford to rest on their laurels. They needed to keep pushing forward, to build on their success, and to ensure that no other empire would ever consider underestimating humanity again. The captains stood on the deck of the warship, their gaze fixed on the stars ahead. They knew that the future was uncertain, but they also knew one thing: humanity would never again be the underdog. They would never again be the forgotten species. They had earned their place in the galaxy, and no one would take it from them. The crew of the warship spent countless hours in training, rebuilding their ship, preparing for the next battle. They knew that no victory was final, no war was ever truly over. They would face new enemies, new challenges, and they would fight with everything they had to protect their people, to protect Earth. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson that day, and humanity had proven that they were not to be trifled with. They would fight, and they would win, but they also knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with trials they could not predict. The captain looked at their crew, each one determined, each one knowing the weight of what they carried with them into the future. The fight against the Armada had been just the first step in humanity's rise to power, and they were ready for whatever would come next. The war was far from over, but humanity had already proven its strength, and the galaxy would never forget it. As the weeks passed, Earth continued to prepare for whatever the galaxy might throw at them. The memory of the Armada's defeat, still fresh in the minds of humanity's leaders, the human military had expanded rapidly. Their fleets were being reinforced with new ships, new technology, and new strategies designed to protect their home and secure their place in the galaxy. The victory over the Armada had shaken the galaxy to its core, but it had also awakened something within humanity, a realization that they were no longer just a small species struggling to survive. They were a force to be reckoned with, and they would make sure the galaxy knew it. The captain of the human warship stood on the deck of the newly upgraded vessel, their mind focused on the future. They knew the victory had been important, but it was only the beginning. The war with the Armada had proven that humanity could stand up against the most powerful forces in the galaxy, but there were still other empires to face, still other species that would seek to take what humanity had earned. They would have to stay vigilant. They would have to continue pushing forward. In the quiet moments between missions, the crew of the warship spent their time training and strategizing. They knew that the battles to come would be even more dangerous than the one they had just fought. The galaxy was a vast and unpredictable place, and there were countless threats waiting to emerge. They couldn't afford to be complacent. They couldn't let their guard down, not even for a moment. The human spirit had won the battle against the Armada, but now they had to make sure it would survive against whatever came next. The crew had grown close over the course of their journey. They had faced danger together, fought side by side, and seen things that no one on Earth could have ever imagined. But they knew that the real fight was still ahead. They couldn't afford to get comfortable. They had to be ready for anything. And that meant continuing to train to push their limits, to never stop improving. The captain walked through the warship's hallways, looking at the faces of their crew. They had been through so much together. And yet they knew the hardest part was still to come. There were other fleets, other empires that would rise up to challenge humanity's newfound place in the galaxy. They could not afford to be complacent. Humanity had shown its power once, but now it had to show that it could sustain it, that it could defend its place in the galaxy against any threat, no matter how powerful. A new wave of tensions was brewing across the galaxy. The defeat of the Armada had created ripples throughout the various empires. Some were beginning to question their own strength, and others were planning their next moves to try and reclaim their dominance over the stars. But humanity was no longer the weak species they had once been. They had proved their might, and now they would defend it. As the warship traveled to new systems, humanity's leaders kept a close eye on the movements of other empires. They had learned to trust their instincts, to anticipate the moves of their enemies, and they would not hesitate to strike back if necessary. The captain stood at the helm of the warship, watching the stars ahead, knowing that their mission was far from over. The fight against the Armada had been just the start. Now humanity had to secure its future and protect its home from any who would try to take it. Each mission brought them closer to their ultimate goal, to ensure that no one would ever threaten humanity again, that no Earth empire would ever dare to challenge them. Their victory over the Armada had given them a taste of the power they were capable of, but now they had to prove that they could hold onto it and defend it against whatever forces would rise to oppose them. The crew stood ready for whatever came next, their hearts filled with the same resolve that had carried them to victory against the Armada. They knew that the galaxy was a vast and dangerous place, but they also knew that humanity would no longer be the prey. Humanity would stand tall, and they would fight with everything they had to protect their future. As the human warship made its way through the stars, the crew felt a deep sense of resolve. They had achieved the impossible. They had faced an overwhelming enemy and come out victorious. But they knew that victory was not a destination, it was a journey, and the road ahead was filled with unknowns. The galaxy had been shaken by their defeat of the Armada, but there were still many more challenges to come, many more enemies who would seek to prove that humanity's rise to power had been nothing more than a fluke, and the crew of the warship knew that they would have to fight with everything they had to ensure their place in the galaxy. The captain stood at the helm, staring out into the vast expanse of space, their mind racing with thoughts of the future. The galaxy was full of unknown dangers, empires rising and falling, alliances shifting at a moment's notice. But one thing had become clear: humanity had proven that they could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest forces in the galaxy and survive. They had proven that they were not just another species to be conquered, they were a species that could conquer. And they would not stop fighting until their place in the stars was firmly secured. The ship's sensors beat as they detected an approaching fleet. A new threat had emerged, one that had heard of humanity's victory over the Armada and wanted to test their strength. The captain's eyes narrowed. This was at the moment. They had been waiting for the moment to prove once and for all that humanity would not be crushed. They had already defeated the Armada. Now they would face whatever came next with the same fire and determination that had carried them through every battle before. The crew gathered in the war room, ready for the briefing. The captain paced back and forth, their voice steady as they laid out the plan. They had fought one empire and brought it to its knees. But this new threat was unlike anything they had faced before. It was an unknown faction with ships unlike anything seen before in the galaxy. They had to be cautious, they had to be smart. But they also have to be ready for a fight that could determine the fate of humanity's future in the galaxy. The captain looked at their crew, each one of them ready for the battle ahead. They had trained for this, they had fought for this. They were no longer the underdogs, they were no longer the weaklings of the galaxy, they were warriors. And this new threat would learn that the hard way: humanity would not back down. They would not be intimidated. They would face this new enemy head-on and prove once and for all that they were a force to be reckoned with. The crew worked quickly to prepare the ship. They loaded the weapons, they rechecked the systems, they made sure every detail was accounted for. This was at the moment when humanity would face its next trial, the moment when they would show the galaxy that their victory over the Armada had been no accident, it had been earned, and they were ready to defend it. As the enemy fleet closed in, the captain stood at the bridge looking out of the stars. They knew that this would be a hard fight, but they also knew that humanity had already proven its strength, and that strength would see them through this battle like every other before. They have faced impossible odds and come out victorious. They would do it again. The crew took their positions, the warship's engines hummed with power, the weapons systems locked into place. The time had come, and they would fight to protect their home, to protect their future, to ensure that no one would ever threaten humanity again. The captain gave the order, and the human warships surged forward into battle. They would face this new threat head-on and show them that humanity's place in the galaxy was not something that could be taken away, not by force, not by fear, not by anyone. The battle had begun, and humanity was ready to fight.